Russ Tremblay had the lodge's old rifle halfway to his shoulder when the moose dropped its head, and the only thing he managed to say was that it couldn't be done. The wind was wrong. You'd put the round through the girl before you ever touched the animal. He was probably right about all of it. He had a shooting medal from a reserve unit 20 years gone, and a way of mentioning it that made other men quieter. So when he lowered the rifle and stepped back from the rail of the deck, nobody on the porch of Cormorant Lake Lodge stepped forward to take it from him. They watched a 13-year-old named Greta Ash stand frozen on the bare gray ice 400 meters out, and they watched 1,200 pounds of wounded bull moose come down off the shore at a flat run, and not one of them moved. The girl's father was already over the rail and into the snow, and he was faster than a man his age in a parka had any right to be. But 400 meters is 400 meters, and the moose had 30. And then the lodge cook picked up the rifle Tremblay had set down, and she said one thing, quietly, the way you'd read a number off a page, and every person on that deck went still as church. If you're watching this one from somewhere cold, do me a favor and put your town in the comments before you go any further. I like to know how far north a story like this can travel. The cook's name, as far as anyone at Cormorant Lake knew, was Nora Whitfield. She had come up the ice road 4 winters back, taken the cook and keep job nobody local wanted because it meant 5 months of isolation past freeze-up, and in 4 years she had given the other staff almost nothing to gossip about, which in a fly-in lodge is itself a kind of legend. She fried eggs for hunting parties. She fixed the generator when Emile Gauthier's hands got too stiff with the cold to hold the wrench. She read paperbacks down to the spine and never once mentioned where she'd read them first. The thing Tremblay and the rest of the porch did not know, the thing that took the wind out of the morning, was that the woman holding the rifle had spent the better part of a decade being the single most accurate human being in any room the Canadian Armed Forces had ever put her in, and that her real name was not Nora. What she said was, 380, full value left, she's quartering. It meant nothing to the guests. It meant everything to the one man on the deck who'd spent 22 years in uniform, listening to people call a shot before they made it. Lieutenant Colonel Owen Ash, 3 days into a quiet, off-grid week he'd booked under his wife's maiden name, precisely so that no one would know where to find him, turned and looked at the cook for the first time as though she were a problem he hadn't solved yet. What Nora Whitfield was doing in the half-second before she fired was arithmetic, and it is worth slowing down to understand it, because everything that came after turned on the fact that she could do it without appearing to do anything at all. A crosswind running left to right at maybe 18 kilometers an hour will push a hunting round several centimeters off its line at that range, more than enough to turn a clean shot into a wounded animal or a dead child. The moose was moving, which meant she had to lead it, place the round not where the animal was but where its shoulder would arrive. The barrel was cold, and a cold barrel throws its first shot slightly differently than a warm one, a quirk every long-range shooter learns to hate and account for. And the girl was standing almost in the lane, which meant the margin she was firing into was not the broadside of a moose, but a hand's width of it, the front of the shoulder, angled away from where Greta stood. Most people, asked to hold all of that in their head at once while a child screamed, would freeze the way the porch had frozen. The reason Nora did not freeze is that the part of her brain that handled it had been trained, over years, to treat the math as the calm thing and the panic as the noise. She breathed out. She did not rush the exhale, and on the bottom of the breath, in the small still place at the end of it, she pressed the trigger straight back. The bull went down mid-stride and slid, and the slide stopped 6 meters short of the girl, and for a moment the only sound at Cormorant Lake was Greta Ash beginning to cry and the ice ticking under the dead animal's weight. Owen Ash reached his daughter a few seconds later. He went down on his knees on the ice and got both arms around her and pressed his face into her hood, and he did not say anything, and his shoulders moved once. A man who had stood in front of generals, without blinking, knelt on a frozen lake and shook, because for 30 seconds he had believed he was going to watch his child die and had been too far away to stop it. Nobody on the porch looked away exactly, but they all found other places to put their eyes, the way decent people do when they've accidentally seen something private. Nora set the rifle back against the rail where Tremblay had left it, and she went down off the deck and out across the ice toward the moose, because the animal was hers. Now, in the sense that she had ended it, and you do not walk away from a thing you've ended. She knelt by its head. There was a length of rusted snare wire, grown half into the muscle of its hind leg, old and infected, the kind of slow cruelty a poacher's lazy trap leaves behind. The animal hadn't charged out of malice. It had charged out of months of pain, finally tipping past the edge of what a body can hold. She rested her gloved hand on its neck for a second, and Émile Gauthier, coming up beside her with his slow river ice walk, saw her do it and said nothing, because Émile had buried enough animals to know that some people need a moment with the ones they kill, and some people don't, and the first kind are usually worth trusting. "That was a long way, that," Émile said. "Not so long," Nora said, and stood and brushed the snow off her knees, and was, in every visible particular, a lodge cook again. But the morning had cracked open, and things that come apart do not go back the way they were. Owen Ash found her in the kitchen an hour later, after Greta had been warmed and checked, and put under 3 blankets in the big room, with a mug of cocoa and Emile's old chocolate lab biscuit, draped across her feet like a heated rug. The Colonel stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Nora portion out stew for 15 people without measuring anything, and he chose his words the way a man chooses footing on bad ice. "That shot," he said. "You called full value before you took it. You called it cold bore. You didn't dial anything. You held off. You held the wind in your reticle by eye." He paused. "Cooks don't do that. I grew up shooting," Nora said. "Gophers off a fence line. You learn to read a breeze." "Gophers," Ash repeated. He had a flat way of repeating a lie back to you just once that made the lie sound as thin as it was. "What's your real name?" She looked at him over the pot. There was a particular thing she did with her face when a question got too close, a kind of door closing without a sound, and she did it now. "Nora Whitfield," she said. "It's on my employment record. You're welcome to check it." "I'm sure it's on your record," Ash said. "That's not what I asked." And then, because he was not a cruel man and he had just watched this woman save his daughter's life, he let it go, but he did not leave the doorway, and the not leaving was its own kind of pressure, and they both understood it. The radio crackled at 4. The lodge ran on a single sideband set, and a satellite phone Émile kept charged off the generator, and at 4 in the afternoon, with the light already going coppery and low, the SSB carried a voice asking whether the lodge could take 2 more guests on the morning flight, a Mr. Daoust and his associate, sportsman, references available. It was an ordinary request. Lodges took late bookings all the time. The thing that made Nora set down her ladle and stand very still was that the voice on the radio asked, almost as an afterthought, whether the lodge had had any other guests come up that week, and gave Owen Ash's actual rank and surname while asking it. Nobody up here knew Ash by his rank. He'd booked as Mr. Renwick. She keyed the set herself before Émile could answer. "Cormorant Lake," she said, in a bored sing-song lodge clerk voice that was nothing like her own. "We're full up and the strip's iced past tolerance. No flights till the weather lifts. Try Pelican Narrows." And she clicked off and stood looking at the dead radio for a moment, and then she went and found Owen Ash and told him, without softening it, that someone had just asked for him by his real rank over an open channel on a sportsman's frequency, and that in her experience, sportsmen did not do that. Ash's whole posture changed, not dramatically. He simply went from being a tired father on holiday to being something harder and more economical, a man taking inventory of exits. "Who knows you're not a cook?" he asked. "You do," Nora said, "as of an hour ago." "Then we're going to have a conversation," Ash said, "and you're going to tell me the truth, because I think my daughter is the reason that man on the radio knew where I was." What he told her, sitting at the long pine table with the lamp low and Greta asleep across the room, was this. 2 months earlier, he had finished an internal review of the test data behind a defense procurement file, a contract worth a great deal of money for a new optic and ammunition package awarded to a firm called Halford Defense Systems. The numbers had been beautiful. They had also been false. Ash, who had spent his career around weapons that had to work the first time because there was rarely a second, had pulled the raw range data and found that someone had quietly thrown out every test where the package underperformed and kept only the ones where it shone. and then signed off on the average as if the discarded data had never existed. He had written it up. He had sent it up the chain to the office of the Provost Marshal and to the National Defense Ombudsman both on the same day because he had been around long enough to know that a report with only one set of eyes on it can disappear. And the man whose signature was on the falsified validation, the officer who had run the testing program before he climbed into the rarefied air of contract oversight, was a full colonel named Theo Brandt. Nora had not moved while he spoke. When he said the name Brandt, something went through her, and Ash, who watched faces for a living, saw it land. "You know that name," he said. "Keep going," she said. "Brandt's people came at me sideways," Ash said. "An audit of my own travel claims that found nothing, a whisper that I was unstable. When that didn't take, the file got quiet in a way that scared me more than the noise had. So I took Greta and came as far off the grid as a man can get and still sleep indoors. And 4 days later, a moose with a poacher's wire in its leg comes off the shore at my kid, and now a voice on the radio knows my rank." He spread his hands flat on the table. "I don't believe in that much coincidence, do you?" "No," Nora said. "Then tell me how you know Theo Brandt." And here she had a choice, the kind she'd spent 4 years arranging her life to never have to make again. And she found that the saving of Greta Ash that morning had quietly taken the choice away from her, because there is no walking back into invisibility once you've stood on the ice and made a shot only a handful of people alive could make. So she told him, not all of it, enough. 4 years before, a reconnaissance team had been sent into a valley on the far side of the world on the strength of an intelligence assessment that turned out to have been built on the same kind of cherry-picked data Ash had just described. A picture, assembled by keeping the reports that supported the operation and burying the ones that didn't. A compound that the brief called a logistics hub had in fact been a place where 40-some people slept who had nothing to do with anyone's war. The shot that opened the operation had been taken by the best long-range shooter in the unit, on a solution handed up from above against her own read of the situation because she had been told the solution was sound and the target confirmed. It was neither. By the time the truth was sortable from the dust, 11 people were dead who should not have been, and the officer who had certified the targeting package, the one whose name was on the assessment, had been a major then, on the rise, ambitious, careful with paper. "His name was Brandt," Ash said. It wasn't a question. "His name was Brandt," Nora agreed. She had done the thing almost nobody does. She had filed against it. She had written through a channel her own commanding officer was supposed to forward and instead buried a report saying the targeting had been falsified and that she would not be the instrument of it again. And then the machine had turned on her with the quiet efficiency it reserves for people who embarrass it. The record was adjusted. A woman who had refused an order on the grounds that it would kill innocents became, on paper, a soldier who had walked off the line under fire. She was carried in the only documents that survived as absent without leave. There had been a brief, ugly stretch where men had come looking for her, not to arrest her, but to make her permanently unavailable to a board of inquiry that never convened. And she had done what she was very good at doing, which was to become no one, in a place no one looked, behind a name that meant nothing. 11 people, Ash said softly, and one of the 11 who knew the targeting was clean was you. You're the witness Brandt could never afford to have surface. I was, Nora said. I've spent 4 years not surfacing. And this morning, Ash said with something close to grief in it, you put a round through the front of a charging bull's shoulder at 380 in an 18K crosswind to save a kid. In front of 9 witnesses and a man who's been quietly running a flag for 4 years on anyone who shoots like the soldier he made disappear. He looked at her. You surfaced. To save Greta, you surfaced. The radio had told them as much. The lodge cook, who could do impossible things with a rifle, was exactly the signature Brandt had paid people to watch for, and the morning shot had pinged something somewhere on a list, and the polite voice asking after sportsmen's lodgings was the first echo of it coming back. The plane could not come until the storm lifted, and the forecast Emil pulled off the SSB said the storm would not lift until morning. That gave the men called day oust until first light to reach a lake with no road in. It gave Nora until first light to decide what kind of person she was going to be when they did. She walked the property in the blue dark before supper, and the narrator would tell you she was thinking like a sniper again, because she was. Cormorant Lake Lodge sat on a point with water on 3 sides and bush on the 4th, and the only ways in were the airstrip and the winter trail that came down off the height of land from the old logging cut. A small plane could not land at night, which meant the men would come overland by sled, which meant they would come down the trail, which meant there was exactly one corridor through which trouble could arrive, and she knew that corridor the way she knew the back of the stove. She found the long sight line down the cut where the trail broke out of the black spruce, 210 meters from the woodshed. She found the place behind the propane shed where a person could lie out of the wind and see that whole stretch of trail. She was not, she told herself, going to need any of it. She made a note of all of it anyway, because hope is not a plan, and 4 years of frying eggs had not unlearned her the difference. Emil found her out there. The old guide had been at Cormorant Lake longer than the current owners, longer than the strip, almost longer than the road, and he had watched Nora Whitfield for 4 winters and drawn his own quiet conclusions and kept them because that was his way. "You're not staffed tonight," he said. It wasn't a question either. The North is full of people who've stopped asking questions and started just saying the true thing and waiting. "No," she said. "I'm not. The colonel told me what's coming." Emil looked down the cut, the same line she'd been reading. "I've been on this lake 40 years. I know where a man on a sled has to slow down, where the trail pinches by the beaver dam, where the ice off the point won't hold a snow machine and a fool will try it anyway." He turned to her. "You tell me what you need. I'll tell you where it is." It is worth pausing on Emile Gauthier because the story turns on people like him as much as it turns on the shot. He was not a soldier. He had never fired a weapon at another human being and did not intend to start at 71. But he had a thing that the men coming up the trail did not have and could not buy, which was 40 years of a single place held in his body, every soft spot in the ice and every blind in the spruce, and he laid it out for Nora over the kitchen table with a stub of pencil on the back of a flour bag. And what he drew her was a map of every advantage the land was willing to give the people who belonged to it. The man who came over the radio at dawn did not call himself Daoust the second time. By dawn there was no point. The storm had blown through faster than the forecast promised, the way storms on the shield sometimes do, and the eastern sky had gone the hard, pale color of an oncoming clear day. And somewhere up in the logging cut a snow machine had been heard, and then deliberately not heard, the engine cut so the last kilometer could be made quiet. Emil heard it first because Emil heard everything. He came into the kitchen and said 2 sleds. 4 men, I think. They left the machines at the beaver dam and they're coming down on snowshoes. Owen Ash had his daughter awake and dressed and was making the kind of fast, clipped decisions a parent makes when love and tactics are pulling in opposite directions. He wanted to run. There was nowhere to run. He wanted to put Greta somewhere armored, and there was no such place, only a log lodge with single-pane windows and a propane tank that was, if anything, a liability. It was Nora who stopped the spiral, and she did it the way she'd stopped the porch the morning before. With a flat true thing said quietly, "We don't run," she said. "Running on open ice in daylight is how they want this to go. We make them come to us, down the only trail there is, through the one place I can see all of." She looked at Ash. "Get Greta into the root cellar with Emil and Biscuit. Concrete on 3 sides, 1 door. You sit on the inside of it. If anyone but me opens that door, you'll know it's not me, because I'll knock twice and then twice, and you'll be where?" Ash said. "Behind the propane shed," she said, looking up the cut. "With what?" She had already gone to the gun locker. The lodge kept 3 rifles for guests, and a 4th that lived in a case at the back that the insurance didn't know about, an old bolt gun Emil had won in a card game and re-barreled himself over the course of 2 winters, more accurate than it had any right to be. She'd cleaned it twice, that fall out of nothing but habit and the comfort of a familiar ritual. She took it out now and worked the action, and the sound of it, that smooth, oiled click-clack, did something to Owen Ash's face. He'd heard that sound from people who could make it mean things, and he heard it now from a lodge cook, and he stopped, finally, arguing. "There's something I need you to understand," Nora told him, low, while she fed rounds into the magazine. 4 years ago, I took a shot on bad information and people died who shouldn't have. I have spent every day since promising myself I'd never put a finger on a trigger again, unless I was certain. This morning, I'm certain. These men came up an ice trail in the dark to a lake with a 13-year-old on it. I know exactly what they are. She looked up at him, but I need you to know I'm not the same person who took that other shot. I won't fire to make a point. I'll fire to make them stop, and not one round before I have to. Why are you telling me this? Ash asked. Because if I don't come back, she said, I want one person who saw me clear to be able to say what I actually was. The narrator can tell you what the 4 men on the trail were, because their kind has a tactical grammar that reads the same in every language. They came down the cut in a staggered file, weapons up, moving in the careful, overlapping bounds of people who'd done this before, and they were good, genuinely good, in the way that money and the right-wrong sort of training can make a man good. But they were good at a problem they did not have. They had come expecting a frightened officer and a child in a building, a clearing operation, a thing to be done quickly in the half-light and explained later as a hunting tragedy on a remote lake. What they did not have in their planning was a single human being lying motionless behind a propane shed at the top end of a 200-meter corridor, breathing slow, who had killed a charging moose with one cold round the morning before, and was now reading the wind down the cut by the way the snow ghosted off the spruce tips. She let them come into the open. This is the discipline that separates her kind from the merely brave. She did not fire at the first man she saw when the range was long and the angle bad and a miss would teach them everything. She waited until the file had committed to the open stretch by the woodshed, where Emil's map said there was no cover for 40 meters in any direction, and then she did not shoot the lead man. She shot the snow. The first round cracked into the packed trail a meter in front of the lead man's snowshoe, close enough to throw ice into his face, and the whole file dropped and scattered for cover that Emil's map had already promised them did not exist. It is a particular and deliberate kind of mercy, the warning shot, and it is far harder than the alternative, because it surrenders surprise to make a point. What it told the 4 men in the space of one heartbeat was that they were in the open, in daylight, under accurate fire from an elevated covered position, at a range where they could not effectively answer, and that the person firing had chosen not to kill the man she could plainly have killed. A voice from behind the woodshed called out a name, not doused. It called, hold your fire. And then after a moment, in the careful tone of a man recalculating everything, Master Corporal Rourke. Down in the root cellar, Owen Ash, with his arms around his daughter and his ear against the cold door, heard the name come up through the floor, and understood that the lodge cook who had saved his child had a rank and a real name, and that someone on the trail had known both, which meant someone had sent these men knowing exactly who they might find. The woman behind the propane shed did not answer to the name. She had not answered to it in 4 years. But she did not deny it either, and the not denying carried down the frozen cut as clearly as a shout. What broke the standoff was not the rifle. It was a second engine, far off and climbing, and then the unmistakable beat of a helicopter coming up the lake, fast and low, and the 4 men in the open knew the sound of that arithmetic too. A bird inbound meant either reinforcement or witnesses, and you cannot finish a quiet operation in front of witnesses. The helicopter was neither theirs nor an accident. It was the result of a phone call Nora had made the night before, on Owen Ash's clean satellite phone, to a number she had carried in her head for 4 years the way you carry a key to a house you swore you'd never go back to. The voice that had answered the call had been a woman's, and the woman's name was Yvette Cardine. And 4 years earlier, she had been the spotter lying beside Nora in the dust of a valley on the wrong side of the world when the bad shot went off. The one other person who had read the targeting solution and known in her gut it was wrong. The only soul on earth who had seen the whole thing clean and lived. Cardin had spent 4 years inside the system trying to find a thread to pull, waiting for the one witness she needed to surface. When the phone rang at Cormorant Lake and a voice said only, "It's me, I'm calling it in," Cardin had not asked a single question. She had said, "We've been hoping you'd call for a long time," and then she had moved heaven and the duty roster of a search and rescue squadron to put a helicopter and a provost marshal's investigator over a lake in northwestern Ontario by mid-morning. The four men melted back up the cut and were gone before the bird touched down, which told everyone watching that they had been the disposable end of the operation, hired distance, men whose value was precisely that they could disappear and could be disowned. Brandt's defense against the morning would be that he had never heard of them. It was the same defense that men of his kind always reached for, and for the same reason. Distance is the only thing they truly trust to protect them, and it is the thing that fails them last and worst. The investigator who climbed down out of the helicopter was a deputy from the provost marshal's office named Frances Aldous, a spare, unhurried woman who had been quietly building a file on Theo Brandt for the better part of a year, and had been missing exactly one thing: a witness with direct knowledge of the original falsified targeting who had survived and could be put on a record under a real name. She found that witness standing behind a propane shed at a fly-in lodge, lowering an old re-barreled bolt gun with frost on her eyelashes and 4 years of careful invisibility coming off her like steam. There was also, on the helicopter, an RCMP sergeant named Will Pelletier, who had been told he was flying out to a remote lodge as part of a routine welfare check on a federal employee, and who had spent the flight slowly realizing that nothing about his tasking added up, that the request had come to him down a chain that bent in a place it shouldn't, and who arrived at Cormorant Lake already half sick with the understanding that he had been someone's unwitting instrument. He would spend the next 2 days burning that chain down to the ground and rebuilding it out of people he could trust, and he would do it well, because there are few things more useful than an honest man who has just discovered the precise shape of how he was used. Greta Ashe came up out of the root cellar into the cold, bright morning, with biscuits shoving past her legs, and she crossed the snow to the woman who had now saved her life twice in 2 days, and she did not say thank you, not at first. She looked up at her with the level, exhausted clarity of a child who had been raised by careful people and had learned to see clearly under pressure, and she said, "That's not really Nora, is it?" "No," the woman said. "What is it really?" And the woman who had been Nora Whitfield for 4 years crouched down so she was level with the girl's face, in the snow, with the helicopter ticking as it cooled, and her old spotter walking toward her across the ice, and said the name out loud for the first time in 4 years. Gave it to a 13-year-old as if it were a thing worth keeping. "Imogen," she said. "Imogen Rourke." "Imogen," Greta repeated, trying it. "Thank you for not waiting until you were sure it was safe." The rest of it took weeks, and was mostly paper, which is how these things actually end. Not with a confrontation, but with a record that cannot be sealed. Imogen Rourke gave her testimony to Frances Aldous under her own name. All of it. The valley and the targeting and the 11 dead, and the report her commanding officer had buried, and the 4 years behind a borrowed life on a frozen lake. She did not dress it up, and she did not spare herself. Owen Ashe's procurement file and her testimony fit together like two halves of a broken thing. The falsified ammunition data and the falsified targeting data revealed as the same habit of mind in the same man across 4 years and 2 continents. The conviction that the truth was whatever survived after you threw out the parts that didn't serve you. Theo Brandt's lawyers moved to have Ashe's report sealed on grounds of national security, which was the move men in his position always made, and it failed for the reason it usually fails. Filing the motion created a record, and the record drew exactly the scrutiny it was meant to prevent, and an honest RCMP sergeant's formal complaint about a compromised tasking chain arrived on the right desk at the right hour. There was no arrest in handcuffs, no dramatic fall. There was an administrative leave, announced internally, and then a quiet retirement that fooled no one who knew, and the specific silence of a career ending that had been built on the belief that distance and paper would always be enough. They were not. They never are, in the end, though they hold up longer than they should. Imogen Rourke was offered reinstatement. Full rank, back pay, the AWOL designation struck from the record, and replaced with language she'd have needed a clearance to read. She thought about it for 2 days, standing out on the ice off the point where the moose had nearly reached Greta Ashe. She wanted it, in the specific way a body wants the thing it was built and broken to do. She missed the long quiet of a good sightline the way you miss a language you used to dream in. But she had spent 4 years becoming someone other than the soldier who'd taken the bad shot, and she understood, standing on the ice, that the version of herself worth keeping was not the one going back to the line, but the one who had crouched in the snow and given her real name to a frightened kid. So she declined the assignment and accepted the commendation, which she could not refuse, and which was signed when it came by Lieutenant Colonel Owen Ash. She stayed north. She bought a stake in Cormorant Lake Lodge from owners, glad to be rid of the isolation, and she turned the long off-season into something she had not known she was looking for. She started running it as a place for the people who came back from the far side of things and couldn't find their footing on this side. Veterans, search and rescue crews who'd seen too much. Kids out of hard homes that the system had nearly thrown out the way it throws out inconvenient data. She taught them to read wind and water and the long quiet. She taught them that the discipline of doing a difficult thing slowly and exactly was a thing a person could rebuild a life on. Emile stayed and drew them all maps. Biscuit got fat and was happy. Yvette Carden came up most summers and stayed longer each time. Greta Ash called on the day the new sign went up over the lodge door, the one with the real name carved into it for the first time in 4 years. She had a steady voice now, the surgery in the lake and the long drive home behind her, and she said 3 things. She said, her father wanted Imogen to know the commendation was going in the permanent file whether she'd taken the posting or not, because he decided a person didn't get to refuse the acknowledgement, only the assignment. She said Biscuit had sent a photo, attached, and there was indeed a photo of a chocolate lab asleep in a patch of sun. And then she said, with the directness of a girl who had stood on bare ice and watched a stranger choose to be exactly who she was, that she'd looked up what cold bore meant, and that she understood now it hadn't really been about the rifle at all. Imogen Rourke sat for a while after the call, with the carved sign drying in the cold sun and her real name on it, and her real history in a record that could not be sealed or buried or thrown out for the crime of being inconvenient. She was not the woman who had walked up the ice road 4 winters ago with nothing but a flour-dusted alias and a key she swore she'd never use. She was the woman who had used it. And when the first of the seasons broken, careful people came up the strip a few weeks later and stood in the doorway and said he didn't know where to start. She looked at him and told him to start anywhere, that there was no wrong place, that the whole point of a long sightline was that you could afford to take your time. She meant it. She had always, underneath everything, meant it.